Have you ever heard of a woman who changed the course of an entire war with nothing but a tent peg and a hammer? This isn't a legend or a myth. This is a real story straight from the pages of the Bible. In a time when armies clashed, kings ruled with iron fists, and men like Sisera, one of the most feared generals in history, commanded hundreds of iron chariots. No one imagined that his fate would rest in the hands of an ordinary woman, inside a simple tent, away from the battlefield. But that's exactly what happened. Today, you'll uncover the shocking story of Jael, the woman who took justice into her own hands when no one else could. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is one of the most unexpected, daring, and powerful moments ever recorded in the Bible. This is the story of betrayal, courage, and divine justice. And it all begins with one unsuspecting woman, a fleeing general, and a decision that would echo through history. In ancient times, when survival depended on strength, strategy, and the ability to strike first, the land of Israel was under the iron grip of oppression. For 20 long years, the Israelites lived under the shadow of fear, dominated by a ruthless king named Jabin. He wasn't just any king. He ruled the land of Canaan with an iron fist, and his most dangerous weapon wasn't a sword or an army of soldiers. It was a man named Sisera. Sisera wasn't your average military leader. He was a war-hardened, merciless general, commanding an army of thousands, armed with 900 iron chariots, the ultimate symbol of unstoppable military power in those days. Those chariots were more than weapons. They were like tanks on the battlefield, crushing anyone who dared to stand in their path. The Israelites had no chance. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered at every turn. Their villages were burned, their people oppressed, their faith tested to the limit. For 2 decades, Sisera's name alone was enough to send fear through every home in Israel. Men whispered his name around the fire, mothers clutched their children tighter, and the people cried out to God for deliverance. But as time passed, hope faded. It seemed like no one could stop him. No army was strong enough. No warrior was brave enough. No leader had the courage to rise. And yet, deliverance was coming, but not in the way anyone expected. Because sometimes, God doesn't use the obvious. Sometimes victory doesn't come with swords, shields, or chariots. Sometimes, it comes from the most unlikely places, and through the most unexpected people. While Israel's men hid in fear, and the land groaned under oppression, a woman rose to the forefront. But not just any woman. A prophetess, a judge, and a leader chosen by God. Her name was Deborah. She wasn't a warrior with armor or a general commanding legions. She was a voice of wisdom, a woman of courage, and a messenger of divine authority. Deborah stood under a palm tree day after day, delivering judgment and guidance to the people who sought her counsel. And though others trembled, she stood firm, because she knew something the rest of Israel seemed to forget. When God decides to act, no army, no chariot, no general can stand in his way. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Despite Deborah's leadership and God's promise of victory, when she called upon Barak, the military commander of Israel, he hesitated. He didn't refuse the mission, but he didn't leap at the chance either. Barak agreed to lead the army, but only under one condition. Deborah had to go with him. Imagine that. In a world where men led battles, where strength was defined by swords and spears, a seasoned warrior like Barak refused to step onto the battlefield without the presence of a woman, not because of her strength, but because of her unwavering faith and connection to God. Barak knew Deborah's words carried weight, and without her, his courage faltered. Deborah agreed to go. But she also spoke a prophecy that would shock everyone listening, one that would forever change the course of history. The honor of victory will not be yours, Barak. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Now pause for a moment and let that sink in. In the ancient world, the idea of a woman defeating a general like Sisera was unthinkable. This wasn't about politics or social roles. This was about raw survival. Sisera was a military machine, a master of war, a symbol of unstoppable force. And yet, a prophecy declared his downfall wouldn't come from an army, but from the hands of a woman. Not Deborah, not a queen, not a warrior, but someone no one saw coming. And this is where the real mystery begins. Who was this woman? How could someone untrained outside the battlefield bring down the most feared general in the region? This is the part of the story that makes people lean in closer, the part where God's strategy unfolds in ways no human mind could predict. Because while Israel prepared for battle, while chariots rumbled across the plains, and while Sisera sharpened his blades, thinking victory was certain, God was setting the stage for a different kind of war. One fought not with strength, but with precision, timing, and the courage of an unlikely hero. Sisera, arrogant and confident, had no idea his downfall wasn't waiting for him on the battlefield. It was waiting somewhere far quieter, hidden away, where he'd least expect it. His fate wasn't sealed by an army. It was sealed by the steady hands of a woman he never saw as a threat. And here's the hook that keeps you locked into this story. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one with the sword. It's the one everyone underestimates. This is the setup. The pieces are moving. Israel's army is gathering. Deborah's prophecy hangs heavy in the air. And Sisera, full of pride, is racing straight into a trap, one designed not by soldiers, but by divine hands. And at the center of it all is Jael, a name unknown to many, yet etched forever into the story of God's justice. The battle is about to begin, but trust me, the real war happens in silence, far from the clashing swords. What Jael does next will not only shock you, it will redefine the meaning of courage. Stay with me, because the moment that changed everything is about to unfold. Sisera was a man built for war. His reputation stretched across the land like wildfire. Brutal, calculating, undefeated. For 20 long years, his name echoed in the minds of Israel's people like a death sentence. He commanded 900 iron chariots, the military superweapons of his time. To put it plainly, facing Sisera on the battlefield was like standing in front of a steamroller, knowing there was no way to outrun or overpower it. The Israelites had fought back before, sure, small skirmishes, desperate uprisings, but every time Sisera crushed them. His army wasn't just stronger, it was smarter, faster, and perfectly coordinated. He had the resources of King Jabin behind him and the fear of the people working in his favor. Resistance wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. But this time, something was different. Under Deborah's leadership, Israel wasn't just relying on numbers or swords. They were fueled by something Sisera couldn't understand: divine timing. When the battle erupted, Sisera unleashed his iron chariots, confident the slaughter would be routine. But suddenly, nature itself turned against him. The Kishon River, swollen by an unexpected storm, flooded the battlefield. Mud sucked the wheels of his mighty chariots into the earth like quicksand, rendering them useless. His advantage vanished in an instant. Panic broke out. His soldiers scattered, tripping over one another, their armor weighing them down like anchors. Israel's warriors surged forward, overwhelming the once mighty army with a ferocity no one thought possible. Sisera, realizing the battle was lost, did what every cornered predator does. He ran. His armor left behind, his men abandoned, his pride shattered. Sisera became nothing more than prey, hunted across the desolate land. For a man like Sisera, used to control and power, fleeing alone through unfamiliar territory was the ultimate humiliation. Every step pounded with exhaustion, fear, and desperation. The same ground he once conquered now betrayed him, offering no shelter, no allies. Only the haunting reminder that the prophecy spoken by Deborah was unfolding whether he liked it or not. But here's the thing most people overlook in this story. When powerful men fall, they don't think logically. Their pride blinds them. Sisera's survival instinct kicked in, but his arrogance whispered in his ear that he still had the upper hand. He believed his reputation alone was enough to find safety, and that's how he stumbled upon the tent of Jael. Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, wasn't a soldier. She wasn't known for strength or strategy. To Sisera, she was harmless, a civilian, part of a neutral tribe with connections to King Jabin's people. In his mind, this woman represented shelter, safety, maybe even loyalty to his side of the conflict. But what Sisera didn't realize is that real danger isn't always standing in front of you, sword drawn. Sometimes it's waiting in the quiet, observing, calculating, hidden behind kindness, disguised as comfort. When Sisera approached Jael's tent, exhausted and desperate, he thought he'd found a temporary refuge. His armor weighed him down no longer. His weapons were discarded. His army was gone. All that remained was his pride and his misplaced trust. Jael greeted him calmly, offering words that felt like relief to a man on the run. Her tone, her presence, her willingness to open her tent to him. It all played into the one thing Sisera couldn't resist: control over the situation. In his mind, he was still the dominant one. Even in defeat, he saw himself as a commander, dictating where he would rest, when he would rise, how he would recover. But Jael had different plans. Plans that didn't involve pride or survival for Sisera. She welcomed him inside, offered him milk instead of water, a small but calculated gesture. Warm milk in those days wasn't just hospitality. It induced sleep, calmed the nerves, dulled the senses. And that's exactly what Sisera needed: to lower his guard, to feel safe, to believe, even for a brief moment, that his nightmare was over. He asked her to stand at the door, to guard him, to lie for him if anyone came looking. His authority, even in hiding, seeped through his words. And Jael? She agreed. No resistance, no argument, no hesitation. But this is where everything starts to shift. Because behind Jael's soft words and seemingly submissive demeanor was the unshakable knowledge that God had chosen this moment, and her, to fulfill a prophecy. Think about that for a second. Jael wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a prophet like Deborah. She wasn't a commander like Barak. But she understood one thing better than most. When God orchestrates a moment, you either act with courage or you let the opportunity pass. And opportunities like this don't come twice. As Sisera drifted into sleep, convinced his troubles were behind him, Jael stood over him, silent, focused, fearless. The general who commanded thousands now lay helpless before a woman society never saw as a threat. His fate, once held by armies and weapons, now rested in the steady hands of a determined woman inside a quiet tent. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't luck. This was divine setup, unfolding exactly as Deborah had declared. The honor of victory, stripped from Barak's hands, was destined for a woman, and Jael was ready to claim it. And what happens next? It's one of the most shocking, unexpected, and powerful moments recorded in the Bible. A moment that proves God uses the underestimated, the overlooked, the ordinary to bring down the seemingly invincible. Stay with me, because the next part of this story will not only surprise you, it will redefine everything you thought you knew about strength, justice, and the courage to act when the world least expects it. Deborah wasn't just another name in Israel's history. She was a complete anomaly in her time. Imagine the world back then, a society built on patriarchal structures, where leadership, warfare, and decision-making were dominated by men. And right in the middle of that rigid system, God raises up a woman, not quietly, not in the background, but front and center as a prophetess, a judge, and the spiritual leader of an entire nation under oppression. Her presence alone challenged every expectation. But Deborah didn't just lead with words. She spoke with authority that came straight from God. People traveled miles to sit under her palm tree, desperate for her counsel, for judgment, for answers. She wasn't armed with swords or shields, yet her influence cut deeper than any weapon. Her leadership wasn't measured by physical power, but by wisdom, discernment, and unwavering faith. And make no mistake, Israel was desperate. For 20 years, their lands were ravaged, their freedom stripped, their confidence shattered under the control of King Jabin of Canaan and his brutal general, Sisera. The Israelites were stuck, defeated physically, crushed mentally, and spiritually paralyzed. But when Deborah stood up, everything began to shift. God didn't give her a vision to sit on the sidelines. He commanded action. Deborah summoned Barak, the military leader, and laid out the plan straight from heaven's strategy. Take 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them to Mount Tabor. God will lure Sisera, with his 900 iron chariots and his troops, to the Kishon River, and there God will hand him over. The instructions were clear. The outcome was guaranteed. But here's where you see the raw human side of even the strongest warriors. Barak, seasoned in battle, a man of military rank, hesitated. His response wasn't one of instant confidence. He looked at Deborah, fully aware of Sisera's terrifying reputation, and made a condition. If you go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. It wasn't cowardice. It was realism. Barak knew the odds. 900 iron chariots weren't just numbers on paper. They were devastating, rolling machines of death, unstoppable across the battlefield. Barak wasn't doubting God entirely, but his faith wasn't solid enough to stand alone. He needed Deborah's presence, her faith, to embolden him, to remind him that God's word wasn't a suggestion, it was a guaranteed outcome. Deborah's answer wasn't wrapped in ego or frustration. She agreed to go, but with a prophecy that rewrote the rules of honor. I will go with you, but the road you're taking will not lead to your glory. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. That statement alone flipped every expectation. In their culture, victory was synonymous with masculine strength. Warriors celebrated, commanders elevated, generals immortalized in song and story. But Deborah's words cut through tradition like a blade. This time, the glory would fall not to Barak, not to soldiers, but to a woman. And no one, not even Barak, could have predicted how literal, how shocking, and how strategic that prophecy would become. Here's where most people misunderstand this moment. They see Deborah's prophecy as a prediction of weakness on Barak's part. But in reality, it was a setup for divine intervention. God wasn't interested in the usual path to victory. He was orchestrating something so unexpected, so precise, that it could only point back to him, using someone the world overlooked, someone the enemy dismissed, someone hiding in plain sight. This wasn't a spontaneous decision. It was prophecy. It was precision. It was God's plan playing out step by step, with Deborah speaking truth, Barak taking action, and an unseen thread of divine strategy pulling the pieces together toward an outcome that would shock both Israel and their enemies. When Deborah declared that Sisera would fall by the hands of a woman, she wasn't guessing. She wasn't suggesting. She was revealing God's strategy in advance, exposing the arrogance of men like Sisera, who believed their status, their strength, their weapons made them untouchable. The reality was, Sisera's downfall was sealed the moment he underestimated God's ability to use the unexpected. And the irony is brutal. While Sisera put his faith in chariots, soldiers, and power, God's victory was already moving through someone far outside the battlefield. Jael, a woman not yet visible in the story, but positioned perfectly for the final blow. This is why Deborah's role was so dangerous to the enemy. She didn't need a sword, her weapon was prophecy, and her presence carried authority. Barak knew it. Israel recognized it. And even Sisera, though too blind by pride to admit it, was walking straight into the trap her words had outlined. But here's where it gets deeper. Deborah's prophecy wasn't just about the battle. It exposed something bigger. God's consistent pattern of using the overlooked to overthrow the powerful. It was never about physical strength. It was about divine timing, obedience, and recognizing that when God speaks, the impossible bends to his will. And that's why this story hooks so many people even today. It flips the predictable narrative. In a world obsessed with power, dominance, and status, God's justice arrives quietly, surgically, through the hands of those least expected. Right now, as we stand in the story, Sisera is running, his army destroyed, his pride fractured, his confidence drained. He doesn't know it yet, but his fate is already sealed, not by another general, but by a woman waiting in silence. And Jael? Her name is about to be etched into history, not as a bystander, but as the instrument of God's precise, unapologetic justice. Stay with me, because the next moment in this story, what Jael does, will not only change Israel's destiny, but it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about strength, courage, and the quiet power of the underestimated. Sisera was a man built for dominance, yet now he was nothing more than a fugitive, stripped of his army, his reputation hanging by a thread, covered in dust and sweat, running like a common criminal through enemy territory. The same man who once commanded 900 iron chariots, who led thousands of soldiers into battle with ruthless precision, was now reduced to one simple, brutal truth: survival at any cost. Imagine the humiliation. For 2 decades, Sisera's name alone was enough to drain the color from a man's face. Parents whispered it as a warning to children. Warriors avoided his army like a plague. He wasn't feared because of charisma or diplomacy. It was raw, unchallenged military power. But now, his soldiers were dead or scattered, his iron chariots stuck in the mud, swallowed by the same earth that once trembled under their wheels. His only option was to run, alone. No army, no bodyguards, no strategy to rely on. And when men like Sisera lose control, they don't just lose battles, they unravel. Pride makes them reckless. Desperation makes them blind. And both of those flaws led Sisera straight to the doorway of Jael. Now most people overlook the brilliance of what happens next because they focus on the obvious. The battlefield is done, the dust is settling. But they forget the most dangerous moment isn't always when swords clash. It's what happens after, when survival depends on reading the room, spotting the hidden threats, calculating every move. Sisera wasn't thinking like a general anymore. He was thinking like prey. His instincts told him to find shelter, any shelter. And when he saw Jael's tent, isolated yet familiar, connected to the neutral Kenite tribe, he thought he'd found his safe haven. Here's where it gets strategic. The Kenites had connections to King Jabin, political ties, mutual agreements. To Sisera, walking into Jael's tent wasn't risky. It was logical. In his mind, she had every reason to protect him. The tribes were allies by association, and in the ancient world, hospitality wasn't just a courtesy, it was sacred. But Sisera underestimated one thing. Loyalty isn't always political. Sometimes it's personal. And Jael's loyalty wasn't with Jabin or Sisera. It wasn't with alliances built on fear or survival. Jael understood the weight of what was happening in Israel. She saw the oppression. She saw the destruction. And most importantly, she recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity to act when the world least expected it. When Sisera entered her tent, he thought he was in control. That was his first mistake. Exhausted, covered in the grime of defeat, driven by arrogance and desperation, he stumbled into the one place where his power meant nothing. Jael greeted him calmly, played the part, offered comfort, every move designed to lower his defenses. She didn't confront him. She didn't raise suspicion. That's the genius of it. Real power doesn't always announce itself. It waits. It listens. It acts with precision. Jael offered him milk instead of water, a subtle but calculated move. Warm milk settles the body, dulls the mind, makes the strongest man feel safe enough to let his guard down. Especially a man like Sisera, running on fear, adrenaline drained, pride wounded. He accepted. Of course, he accepted. To Sisera, this wasn't a battlefield. It was a temporary escape. One last moment to breathe before figuring out his next move. But there wouldn't be a next move. That's the part that keeps people hooked to this story. The realization that Sisera walked straight into the hands of a woman who was already 10 steps ahead. Think about it. The prophecy was in motion. Deborah had declared that a woman would take the honor of victory, not through combat, but through strategy, through timing, through bold, decisive action that no one saw coming. Jael wasn't just reacting to the moment. She owned it. Meanwhile, Sisera, oblivious, made his second mistake. He trusted appearances. He looked at Jael and saw a harmless woman, bound by tribal customs, offering him milk and shelter. He told her to stand guard, to lie if anyone came looking for him. Even in his weakened state, Sisera tried to assert dominance, to control the situation, clinging to the scraps of power he once had. But control is an illusion when you're standing on the wrong side of God's plan. And that illusion was about to be shattered, not by armies, not by kings, but by a woman armed with nothing but courage, resolve, and the willingness to do what no soldier on the battlefield dared to do. This is the part of the story where everything tightens, where the viewer leans in, where history pivots on one single calculated moment inside the quiet walls of Jael's tent. The battlefield may have been miles away, but the real victory, the moment that would echo through generations, was seconds from unfolding. Sisera believed he was safe. He believed the war, for him, was over. But wars aren't always won in plain sight. Sometimes the final strike comes not with fanfare, but in silence, by the hands of someone everyone overlooked. And Jael? She was ready to end the oppression, ready to claim the moment, ready to fulfill the prophecy that declared no army, no chariot, no general, no matter how feared, could stand against the hand of divine justice. What happens next? It's not just shocking, it's legendary. The kind of ending that turns the expected upside down and leaves you questioning everything about power, courage, and the underestimated role of those the world never sees coming. Stay locked in, because Jael's next move changes everything. Jael wasn't born a warrior. She didn't wear armor, she didn't carry a sword, she didn't march with armies or train in battle tactics. From the outside, she looked like every other woman of her time, part of a nomadic tribe, living in tents, working with her hands, raising her family, managing the daily routines of survival in the harsh conditions of the desert. But here's the truth most men miss. Survival in that world wasn't for the weak. Life in the wilderness sharpened instincts, hardened resolve, and taught you when to act and when to strike. Jael belonged to the Kenite people, a tribe that navigated alliances carefully, maintaining peace with surrounding nations, including Jabin, the king of Canaan. To the world, they were neutral, not enemies, not allies, just quietly existing on the edges of conflict, avoiding the bloodshed that tore Israel apart. And because of that, Sisera assumed he could trust her. His arrogance told him neutrality meant loyalty to power. His pride convinced him that no one from Jael's camp would dare oppose a general of his status. But Jael saw through the illusion. She lived close enough to oppression to understand its weight. She saw how Jabin's rule, reinforced by Sisera's brutality, drained hope from the people of Israel. And more importantly, she understood that neutrality was no longer an option when injustice dominated the land. You're either standing with oppression, or you're standing against it. And Jael had already made her decision long before Sisera stumbled into her tent. This is where her brilliance shines. She didn't confront him directly. She didn't announce her intentions. She didn't need to posture. Real power operates quietly beneath the surface, calculated and controlled. She watched him, exhausted, filthy, defeated. His confidence shattered, but his arrogance still intact. Offering him shelter wasn't submission, it was strategy. Giving him milk wasn't hospitality, it was calculated preparation. Everything Jael did was deliberate, positioning herself for the moment that would change the course of history. Think about the courage that took. Jael wasn't facing an ordinary man. Sisera was a battlefield legend, responsible for the deaths of thousands, a man feared across nations. Even in his weakened state, he was dangerous. But Jael didn't flinch. She recognized the prophecy in motion, Deborah's words echoing in her mind. The Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. Most would have doubted, hesitated, let the moment slip by. But Jael knew hesitation was a luxury you couldn't afford when God hands you the opportunity to end oppression with your own hands. And let's get real for a second. How many people in her position would have played it safe? How many would have hidden, avoided conflict, clung to neutrality, told themselves someone else would step up? But Jael understood something the strongest warriors often forget. Sometimes the most significant victories aren't won by brute force, but by bold, decisive action from those no one expects. Her environment prepared her for this. Living among tents, moving through harsh landscapes, mastering the tools of survival. These weren't signs of weakness, they were quiet training grounds. A tent peg wasn't just part of her daily life. In her hands, it became a weapon, precise and lethal, symbolizing resourcefulness over raw violence. And Sisera, he never saw it coming. His last mistake was misjudging the quiet strength of a woman raised in the realities of desert life. A woman hardened not by war, but by the demands of survival in a ruthless world. He underestimated the fierce clarity that comes from witnessing injustice and the unwavering courage of someone ready to stop it, regardless of the cost. Jael's story flips the narrative of power on its head. It shows you that real strength isn't always loud or visible. It operates under the radar, waiting for the exact moment to strike, and when it does, the impact is unforgettable. Stay locked in, because what Jael does next, with nothing but a simple tool from her daily life, will not only fulfill prophecy, but bring down a general that entire armies couldn't defeat. This isn't about brute strength. This is about timing, courage, and understanding that sometimes God places victory in the hands of those the world never bothers to fear, until it's far too late. Sisera lay there, exhausted, breathing heavily, thinking for the first time in years that maybe, just maybe, he had outsmarted the storm closing in around him. His army was gone. His iron chariots, the machines that once ruled the battlefield, were stuck and useless, abandoned in the mud. His soldiers, his allies, even his reputation had crumbled in a single day. But here, inside Jael's tent, wrapped under a blanket with milk settling in his gut, he thought he had bought himself time. That illusion of control, of safety, of temporary victory was his final mistake. What Sisera didn't know was that every moment inside that tent was part of a plan bigger than his military mind could grasp. Because while he saw weakness, a lone woman, isolated, outside the lines of battle, God had already orchestrated his downfall through the one person he never suspected. And here's where the story turns from survival to justice, and from justice to legacy. Jael wasn't operating on impulse. She wasn't acting out of panic. Every move she made was calculated, precise, steady. Years of desert life, of handling tents, tools, and the raw elements had trained her hands for control. The same peg and hammer used to secure shelter from the desert winds would now become instruments of divine justice. But think about the weight of that moment for Jael. She stood over a sleeping giant, a man who had terrorized nations, crushed armies, and silenced opposition with brute force. Even in defeat, Sisera's reputation lingered like smoke after a fire. One wrong move, one hesitation, and the balance of power could shift again. But Jael wasn't hesitating. She wasn't questioning whether this was her place, her battle, her responsibility. She recognized what most people miss. The window to act was now, and once gone, it would never return. This wasn't just about Sisera's downfall. It was about fulfilling prophecy, seizing the moment, and sending a message that even the most ruthless oppressor isn't untouchable when God appoints justice. With unwavering resolve, Jael took the tent peg in one hand, the hammer in the other, and approached silently. There was no army behind her, no crowd cheering, no soldiers backing her up. It was one woman standing over the enemy of her people, fueled not by rage, but by clarity. The understanding that when injustice pushes people to the edge, someone has to have the courage to finish what others are afraid to start. And here's what separates Jael from everyone else in this story. She didn't need permission. She didn't need validation. She didn't wait for an army to rally or a command from a leader. She saw the enemy vulnerable, saw the prophecy hanging over his head, and she acted. With one precise strike, she drove the tent peg through Sisera's temple, straight into the ground beneath him. It wasn't a drawn-out confrontation. It wasn't a battle of words or strength. It was clean, deliberate, final. The same tools used daily to secure her home became the instruments that secured Israel's justice. In that quiet moment, the mighty general, who once dictated the fate of thousands, was reduced to nothing. His arrogance, his brutality, his legacy of oppression ended not on a battlefield with armies clashing, but in silence, at the hands of the very person he never thought capable of defeating him. But let's not miss the deeper layer here. This wasn't just personal victory for Jael. Her action fulfilled the exact words spoken by Deborah, that Sisera's fate would fall to a woman. And with that, the story wasn't just about battle tactics or brute strength. It became a statement, a declaration, that God's justice doesn't always come through the expected paths. Sometimes it comes through the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones the world dismisses as powerless. Jael's strike didn't just end Sisera's life. It shattered the illusion that oppression could last forever, that the strong always win, and that ordinary people can't play extraordinary roles in history. And for the people of Israel, this moment changed everything. The tide of fear began to break. The oppressor's strongest weapon, the image of being invincible, had fallen, not by military might, but by the courage of one woman who refused to stay silent or neutral when history demanded action. But this victory wasn't just tactical, it was symbolic. Sisera's death by Jael's hands sent shockwaves through the land. It reminded every man, every leader, every enemy watching that the God of Israel doesn't operate within human limitations. He elevates the willing, he arms the prepared, and he fulfills his word in ways that no one, not even the most feared general, can escape. Jael became the unexpected force that turned prophecy into reality. No fanfare, no battlefield glory, but undeniable, irreversible justice, carried out with the precision and courage of someone who understood that the tools of survival can become the tools of victory when placed in the right hands at the right moment. The ripple effects of her act were just beginning. The war wasn't fully over, but the narrative had changed. The fear that once paralyzed Israel was cracking, replaced by a quiet, growing confidence that even the strongest enemies have weaknesses, and sometimes those weaknesses are exposed by the people no one thinks matter. And that's the part of this story that keeps you hooked. It flips the power dynamic. It forces you to see that courage doesn't wear a uniform, justice isn't always loud, and victory often belongs to the ones who act while others hesitate. Stay with me, because what happens next, how the nation responds, how Deborah and Barak realize the prophecy has come full circle, and how Jael's name is forever cemented in Israel's legacy, will show you that history isn't shaped by the obvious. It's shaped by those willing to seize the moment, even when the world tells them to stay quiet. When Jael stood over Sisera's lifeless body, with the tent peg buried deep into the ground and the echo of prophecy fulfilled in that silent tent, the world outside hadn't caught up to what just happened. But make no mistake, that strike was not random. It wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't luck. It was purpose, executed with precision, and the final seal of a divine plan that had been unfolding long before Sisera ever set foot near Jael's home. Here's the reality that most men overlook about this story. Jael didn't just act on instinct. She stepped into a role that had been divinely set in motion by the words of Deborah. What happened inside that tent wasn't an isolated moment of survival. It was the physical, undeniable proof that when God speaks, the outcome is guaranteed, no matter how impossible it looks to human eyes. Deborah had declared, before the battle even started, that Sisera wouldn't fall by the hand of Barak, the military leader, but by the hand of a woman. It sounded absurd at the time. In a world defined by strength, armies, and visible power, no one expected a woman, armed with nothing but household tools, to accomplish what entire armies couldn't. But that's exactly how God operates, overturning expectations, dismantling pride, and using the underestimated to deliver justice. And here's where things get deeper. Sisera didn't lose because he was outnumbered, or because Israel suddenly gained the upper hand militarily. He lost because he ignored the warning signs, because pride blinded him to the reality that his time of dominance was over, and judgment was closing in fast. But more importantly, Jael's act proves that divine justice isn't always loud, public, or surrounded by applause. Sometimes it happens quietly, in a tent far removed from the battlefield, carried out by someone the world never paid attention to. And yet, its impact shakes nations. For Israel, the weight of Sisera's defeat wasn't just tactical. It was spiritual, symbolic, and psychological. Imagine this. For 20 years, Sisera's name struck fear into every household. Fathers spoke of him in whispers. Mothers clung to their children, praying they'd never see the dust of his chariots on the horizon. Entire tribes lived under the dark cloud of his oppression. His defeat didn't just eliminate a general, it shattered the myth that he was unstoppable. And here's the part you can't ignore. God could have used any means to bring down Sisera, an army, a storm, a disease. But he chose Jael. Why? Because God's justice doesn't just aim to defeat the enemy. It exposes the arrogance, humbles the powerful, and elevates the forgotten. Jael wasn't a soldier. She wasn't trained in combat. But she understood timing, opportunity, and obedience. Her hands, skilled from years of survival in the desert, secured her home daily with the same tools she used to end the oppression that plagued her people. God used what was already in her hands, the ordinary, to produce the extraordinary. That's what separates this story from countless battle accounts in history. It wasn't brute strength. It wasn't overwhelming numbers. It was precision. It was the courage to act when hesitation could have let evil slip away once again. But think for a second about the scene after Sisera's final breath. The land, quiet. The war outside still fresh in the air. Israel's soldiers chasing shadows, unsure of the general's fate. And there, in a solitary tent, justice was sealed. Not with fanfare, but with certainty. The fulfillment of Deborah's prophecy didn't just mean victory for Israel. It restored faith. Faith that God sees oppression. Faith that he raises up unlikely heroes. Faith that no matter how long the enemy seems to win, their downfall is inevitable when divine justice is set in motion. And that's where this story hooks into something bigger. It's not just history, it's a reminder. A reminder that power structures built on fear will always look invincible, until they crumble, often by the most unexpected hands. A reminder that when God positions someone for a moment, no reputation, no army, no fortress can protect the oppressor. Jael's action didn't just change Israel's circumstances, it shattered psychological barriers. It told every Israelite living in fear that the enemy bleeds, the oppressor falls, and God's promises are not empty words spoken from a mountaintop. They manifest, sometimes in the quiet places, through the willing, through the overlooked, through those bold enough to strike when the opportunity arises. And let's be honest, how many people today still think they're invincible like Sisera? Powerful men blinded by pride, convinced their position, resources, or reputation make them untouchable. But history proves, again and again, that arrogance creates blind spots. And in those blind spots, God plants the unexpected. People like Jael, moments like this, reminders that justice may be delayed, but it never fails to arrive. This wasn't luck, this wasn't chance, this was divine precision. The exact fulfillment of prophecy, a strike that echoed beyond the tent walls, through the hills, into the hearts of Israel's people, reigniting hope, courage, and the certainty that God is still in control, even when the enemy seems undefeatable. Jael's moment wasn't about personal glory, it was about stepping into a plan bigger than herself. And her courage didn't just earn her a footnote in history, it etched her name into the legacy of Israel, into the proof that when God says the enemy will fall, it doesn't matter how impossible it looks, that fall is coming. Stay with me, because this story isn't over. What happens after Sisera's death reshapes the course of Israel, and what Jael does next cements her as one of the most unexpected, yet most significant figures in biblical history. Jael never held a title. She wasn't called a judge like Deborah. She wasn't introduced to Israel as a prophetess, a warrior, or a leader in the formal sense. But make no mistake, her actions that day positioned her right alongside the greatest names in the history of Israel. What she did inside that tent wasn't just an isolated moment of bravery. It was an act of divine justice that shook the foundation of how people understood leadership, power, and the role of the unexpected in God's plan. See, most people still think leadership comes with a title, recognition, or years of public authority. But what Jael proves, with undeniable clarity, is that God doesn't wait for human qualifications to use someone for his purpose. She wasn't voted into power. She wasn't born into a ruling family. No one anointed her with oil or gave her a formal commission. But when the opportunity presented itself, when the fate of a nation, the weight of prophecy, and the downfall of an oppressor collided, she stepped in and did what had to be done. And here's the brutal truth. Most men in that time, maybe even today, would have overlooked her entirely. She wasn't standing on a battlefield. She wasn't commanding troops. But Jael understood something most warriors forget. The battle doesn't always happen where swords clash. Sometimes it happens in the silence, in the shadows, where one decisive act changes everything. The moment Sisera's body hit the ground, pierced through by the tent peg, Jael wasn't just a bystander to history. She became the central figure in the victory God had promised. The honor that Barak, the military commander, sought didn't belong to him. The credit for delivering Israel from the hands of Canaan's most feared general didn't go to an army, a king, or even the trained warriors of Israel. It went to a woman who saw her moment and acted with the kind of courage most men wouldn't summon even in the heat of battle. That's why Jael's story hits differently. It doesn't follow the formula people expect. It breaks every rule of how victory, power, and influence are supposed to look. No grand speeches, no formal titles. Just action, precision, and the fulfillment of God's word, all carried out by hands hardened from daily survival, not battlefield experience. And let's not underestimate the impact of that. Israel, after 2 decades of oppression, had grown used to fear. They believed Sisera was untouchable, that his chariots of iron were invincible, that their cries for deliverance had fallen on deaf ears. But with one strike, Jael shattered the myth of Canaanite superiority. She proved that no oppressor, no matter how terrifying, is beyond God's reach. Here's the deeper layer, though. Jael operated as what I call a hidden judge. She didn't hold court like Deborah. She didn't stand beneath the palm tree offering public counsel. But in that critical moment, she executed justice with more precision than any courtroom ever could. Justice, after all, isn't always clean or procedural. Sometimes it's raw. Sometimes it requires stepping into danger when no one else will. Sometimes justice looks like a lone woman, armed with a tent peg, taking down the most feared man in the region while the world still thinks victory is impossible. And the legacy? Jael's name was immortalized, not because she chased recognition, but because her act spoke louder than any title ever could. Deborah herself, the prophetess of Israel, sang about Jael's victory in one of the most iconic songs recorded in the Bible, the Song of Deborah. In that song, Jael isn't described as weak or passive. She's called Blessed Among Women, a title reserved for those who change the course of history. What makes this even more powerful is how God's pattern repeats. Throughout the Bible, God consistently elevates the unexpected: the shepherd boy who becomes king, the prisoner who becomes prime minister, the overlooked woman who brings down a general. Jael fits that pattern perfectly. Overlooked by men, chosen by God, elevated by obedience. And that's the part that should keep every man watching this locked into the story. It challenges the entire definition of strength. It forces you to see that sometimes the most decisive victories don't happen with armies or titles, but with clarity, courage, and the willingness to act when the moment arrives. Jael didn't need recognition to operate in purpose. She didn't wait for permission to act when injustice laid vulnerable before her. And that's why her story still echoes today, because real leadership isn't measured by position, but by action. In the end, she wasn't just the woman who ended Sisera's reign of terror. She was a vessel for God's justice, a living reminder that when God's prophecy unfolds, it doesn't matter how unexpected the source may be, the outcome is certain, the oppressor falls, and the faithful are delivered. And this story isn't over yet. What happens after this moment, how Israel responds, how Deborah's song cements Jael's name in history, how this single act shifts the entire power structure of the region. All of that shows that when God raises someone up, even the hidden, even the underestimated, their impact reaches beyond the moment, shaping generations. Stay with me, because what unfolds next takes this story from legendary to undeniable proof that the underestimated always have a role in rewriting history, especially when they're walking in step with God's timing. Jael's story doesn't just end with the fall of Sisera. What she did inside that tent sparked a ripple effect far beyond that moment. It wasn't just the death of a general. It was the dismantling of a system built on oppression, arrogance, and the illusion that certain enemies are untouchable. Her act didn't just change the trajectory of a single battle. It altered the mindset of an entire nation that, for 2 decades, had been paralyzed by fear. And that's where the real lessons of this story hit hard. Because when you strip away the history, the cultural context, and the battlefield details, what remains is a brutal, undeniable truth. You can't underestimate the power of someone who recognizes their moment, and you can't measure victory by appearances. Think about it. For 20 years, Israel lived under the crushing weight of Sisera's military dominance. His chariots were more than just machines. They were symbols of unstoppable power. His soldiers weren't just troops. They were reminders of Israel's helplessness. People prayed, they cried out, they hoped for deliverance, But every time those iron wheels rolled across their land, hope seemed further away. But in the middle of that, God was orchestrating something different. Not a revolution led by warriors, not a sudden rise of military strength, but a quiet, strategic setup that would expose how fragile even the strongest enemy becomes when God's justice steps in. Jael's moment teaches that lesson better than any battlefield victory ever could. She wasn't trained for war. She didn't stand on the front lines. But what she had was awareness. She saw the signs, recognized the prophecy, and understood one crucial thing. When the opportunity to break oppression presents itself, hesitation is the real enemy. And that lesson isn't locked in the pages of ancient history. It applies to every man watching this right now. How often do we underestimate the power of action because we think we don't have the title, the position, the recognition? How often do we talk ourselves out of stepping up because the enemy looks bigger, stronger, louder? Jael shows us that courage isn't always about brute strength. It's about timing, discernment, and being ready to act, even when the world expects you to stay silent. But there's more. Her story also crushes the myth that change only comes from the top down. Israel's liberation didn't start with a king or a warrior. It started with an ordinary woman who recognized that the tools in her hands and the wisdom in her heart were enough to end the cycle of fear. And here's the hard truth. Most people, when faced with that kind of moment, freeze. They calculate the risk, overthink the consequences, talk themselves out of the opportunity. But Jael didn't freeze. She acted with clarity, and in doing so, proved that the greatest shifts in history often come from the ones willing to move when everyone else hesitates. Look around today, and the pattern repeats itself. Power structures built on fear still exist. Systems of control still rise. Arrogant leaders still believe they're untouchable. But history, and this story, reminds us that those structures are always vulnerable to collapse when unexpected people, equipped with courage and obedience, refuse to let the moment pass. There's another layer to this that men often overlook: the mental warfare that comes with oppression. Israel wasn't just physically defeated before Jael's act. They were mentally trapped. Oppression conditions people to believe there's no escape, that the enemy is always stronger, that the system can't be broken. But the moment Jael struck that final blow, she didn't just kill a general. She shattered the psychological chains holding Israel captive. And that's why the story of Jael isn't just about a physical victory. It's a blueprint for mental and spiritual warfare. It teaches that the most dangerous weapon the enemy has isn't always swords or chariots. It's fear. It's convincing people they're powerless. It's making them believe change is impossible. But when Jael drove that tent peg into Sisera's skull, she wasn't just ending his life. She was proving that fear is a lie, that oppression has an expiration date, and that even the most ordinary person becomes lethal when aligned with God's timing. So what are the real takeaways from her story? First, never underestimate yourself, because the world doesn't see your value. Jael wasn't celebrated before her act. She wasn't on anyone's radar. But when her moment came, she was ready. Second, understand that God uses what's already in your hands. Jael didn't need a sword or an army. She used the tools of her everyday life, turned them into weapons, and changed history. Third, recognize that the biggest victories often come from those unexpected to win. Jael didn't look the part, but she played the most critical role in Israel's liberation. And finally, know that courage is contagious. After Sisera's death, Israel's confidence returned. The fear that gripped them for 2 decades cracked, and the foundation of oppression began to crumble. What Jael did wasn't just an isolated moment. It was the spark that reignited a nation's belief that they weren't powerless, that the enemy wasn't invincible, and that God's promises weren't distant hopes. They were unfolding realities. And here's where it gets even better. This wasn't the end of her recognition. Deborah the prophetess immortalized Jael's act in song, declaring her most blessed among women. Imagine that. A woman who started the day unknown, operating quietly on the edges of society, became a national hero sung about for generations, not because she sought fame, but because she understood her moment, acted decisively, and aligned her courage with God's plan. Her story reminds every man watching this that leadership isn't about status, it's about action. Victory isn't always about overwhelming strength. It's about precision, timing, and obedience. And the enemy's greatest weapon, fear, is dismantled the moment one person dares to believe they're capable of making the impossible happen. Stay with me, because the final part of this story shows exactly how Israel responded to this unexpected victory, how Deborah's song of triumph echoed through the land, and how Jael's name became permanently written into the history of a nation delivered by courage, precision, and the undeniable justice of God. The story of Jael doesn't just end with a dead general and a fulfilled prophecy. It leaves behind one of the most raw, uncomfortable, but undeniably powerful reminders about how God operates and how history is shaped by the ones bold enough to step into their moment, even when the world underestimates them. And here's where I need every man watching this to lean in, because the story is not just about the past. It's a blueprint for how we confront the impossible today. Jael's name became more than a footnote. Her actions rewrote the direction of an entire nation, and the aftermath of what she did rippled far beyond that tent. You need to understand the weight of what followed. After Sisera's death, the psychological grip of oppression that had paralyzed Israel for 2 decades finally snapped. His army was destroyed, his chariots abandoned, his reputation shattered. But more than that, his defeat sent one message through the land. No one, no matter how powerful they seem, stands against God's justice and walks away victorious. That single act, quiet, calculated, precise, sparked a renewed fire within Israel. The people who had once walked with their heads down, beaten down by years of fear, now saw proof with their own eyes that the tide had turned. The impossible wasn't impossible anymore. But I want to make something clear. Jael's moment wasn't handed to her wrapped in comfort or certainty. She stepped into a dangerous situation. She acted without guarantees of applause or recognition. That's what makes her victory so relevant even today. Most people wait for perfect conditions to act. They wait for titles, backup, or approval from others. Jael didn't have any of that. All she had was clarity, the understanding that when injustice crosses your path, hesitation is deadly, but action is history in the making. And history remembered her. Deborah, Israel's prophetess and leader, didn't just celebrate the victory in silence. She composed one of the most iconic songs in the entire Bible, the Song of Deborah. It's not just a song of praise for a battle won. It's a declaration that God uses the unexpected, the overlooked, the underestimated to accomplish his plans. In that song, Jael is lifted up as blessed among women. Imagine that. No crown, no royal bloodline, no position of authority, yet her name is elevated alongside the greats, cemented in the legacy of Israel's survival and triumph. And you can't overlook the symbolism here. God didn't raise up a new army to crush the enemy. He raised up an individual, hidden in plain sight, armed with nothing but the tools of her daily life and the courage to act. That's how God works. He doesn't need the flashy, the famous, or the obviously strong. He uses what's available, and more importantly, he uses the ones ready to move when the time comes. Now, I want you to think about your own life. How many moments have passed you by because the enemy looked too big? How many times have you believed the lie that you're not equipped, not qualified, not the type God would use? Jael didn't wait for permission. She didn't let fear dictate her choices. She acted with precision and purpose, and in doing so, she redefined the meaning of courage for generations to come. This story is about more than a tent peg and a fallen general. It's about the destruction of fear, the collapse of arrogance, and the rise of courage where no one expected it. It's a reminder that sometimes victory doesn't look like a battlefield full of warriors. It looks like one person standing alone, refusing to let the moment slip away. Jael's victory was brutal, yes. It was raw, but it was necessary. It reminds us that justice isn't always polished, it's not always comfortable. But when God positions someone for a task, they either step in with courage or they watch the moment pass by. Israel's freedom didn't begin with an army. It began in the silence of a tent, with a woman most men wouldn't have given a second thought to. But that's the beauty of God's justice. It's unpredictable, precise, and unstoppable. So ask yourself, What tent are you standing in today? What enemy has convinced you they're too powerful to fall? What moment is God placing in front of you, waiting to see if you'll act or hesitate? This story proves, beyond question, that the underestimated have always been God's greatest weapons against impossible odds. And maybe, just maybe, He's positioning you for your own Jael moment. If this story opened your eyes, challenged your thinking, or gave